All right, so when I messed with the last air compressor, I said that I had another one, a much older one to mess with too. And so this is it. And it hasn't run in, I'm guessing, a good while. It was something that my grandfather threw out and my dad grabbed just because it's cool. And I don't know a whole lot about it because there isn't a whole lot of information I could find online, just searching the model number. But it's kind of hard to read all that, but there's the information about it. And it is a craftsman, just like the last one. And I don't know what era it came from. I'm guessing it's from the 60s. Maybe it might be from the 50s, but I would guess at the newest, the 60s, because my dad remembers using it as a kid in the mid to late 70s. So, and it does, because it doesn't have any protective stuff on it. I mean, it can't be much newer than the 70s. So things that are wrong with it. First and foremost, we have just the usual capacitor issue here, because I'm not going to do it now just because of the hassle, but you plug it in and it just hums, but it won't start. But if you really give it a good whip, it'll get going. And that's pretty much the telltale sign of a bad start capacitor, where the capacitor isn't giving the correct power to the start winding to provide the necessary torque to get it going. And don't know what happened to it. Here's the new capacitor I got, but we'll get to that in a minute. This was all dented in. I think my dad and I hammered that back out whenever the last time we messed with this, which was probably 10 years ago at this point. But yeah, so something fell on top of the motor and it completely shattered the capacitor here, and so that is why the capacitor's dead. And check out this cool name, Aerovox. I mean, that is probably one of the coolest sounding brands I've ever seen. But yeah, so I got a new capacitor, and when you're buying a capacitor, just match the specs, don't match the size per se. So I couldn't find one that was this size, but I found the smaller one. Well, the smaller one will fit in there, so it's fine. And more importantly, it's the same 161 to 193 microfarads at 120 volts, 60 hertz. So I got to get that on there. This one's soldered on, so I'm going to cut these wires, and I have some scraps up there with some spade connectors to hook onto the other one, because I don't want to solder the other one on in case I ever have to mess with it again. And so things that need to be fixed. Well, just like the other one, I'm going to have to rig up an air filter of some kind. Something that looks, kind of period correct for this thing, because I don't want to just put some new plastic crap on it. So, got to fix the capacitor. The regulator diaphragm is torn, and so it doesn't work, but that would probably be the absolute last thing to get fixed, if I get that far. Just starting at the top, this line here is pretty much kinked, so I'm going to have to make up a new hard line for that, which I don't think that'll be too big of a deal. And biggest problem is the only piece of plastic on here is broke, because this is supposed to go here, and so I'm gonna have to come up with a way to fix that, because this is the pressure shutoff, which has kind of a cool deal. It still has the original paper in it. It's just stuck in here. If I just, drop it in the oil. So here it's got some information about it. And I forget where it said that it shut off at. Oh, there we are. So this is what it is set at. So it apparently can build up to 100 PSI per that. I'll probably choke it down to more of like 60. But yeah, so that piece of plastic's got to be fixed. I got to figure out how to get air pressure to this switch, make sure the switch works. I got to find an older style gauge to put on here, because this one is obviously broken. It needs to be cleaned up. And I need to pop the motor off, and I'm hoping it's just this cover that's leaking oil out on everything, but I gotta reseal that because it's just leaking oil all down the tag there and tearing it up. So I'm gonna get going on that. Okay, so I think the source of the oil leak here is the cover wasn't tight for some reason. I'm not sure why, because there's no indication that anybody's messed with anything here, but everything is in really good shape. I mean, the ball bearing here has absolutely no play in it in any direction, and it's all smooth. The connecting rod doesn't have any play on the crankshaft. I mean, just absolutely nothing. So this thing's in really, really good shape. So I don't know what shape the rings are in. I'm guessing they're not, or the ring and the cylinder, rings in the cylinder, I'm guessing they're not in the best shape because there's no telling how long it was run without an air filter on it. But given that this thing leaks all of its oil out because I pulled the thing off and pretty much no oil came out of it, so I was more worried about it being run out of oil at some point. But I mean, it all seems good in here. It's all clean, didn't see any debris. So I was gonna pop this cover off and reseal it, but I think I'm not gonna risk tearing that gasket, and I'll just make sure the bolts are snug. And then I'm gonna clean up this one and put some gasket maker on there and put this one back together, and then we'll see if it still leaks. I ended up getting gifted this heat shrink that has some solder in it. And so you just put the heat gun on it until the solder melts, and it works out really good for stuff like this because I don't have to hold, you know, 2 wires and then a piece of solder while stuff's dangling around. So that worked out pretty good. And I'm going to place it like this, and I used these insulated spade connectors, so this will all keep it from moving side to side, and then because the wire's on the other side, it won't rattle around that way so much. So I'm gonna go get the cover back on it, and then just plug it in, make sure the motor turns on and such. And then I'm gonna have to wait until a warmer day because I really need to pressure wash this thing. Just take the motor off and pressure wash it, but it's like 20 degrees outside today, so I'm not doing that now. But I can go ahead and get the motor itself buttoned up and make sure it still works.
The thing I was concerned about is the pop-off valve that was on here, because I don't know what it's rated at or if it actually works. So I pulled the one out of the Husky here, and so I was testing it, and this thing is fairly wore out. That's why it doesn't matter that it doesn't have a filter, and the switch doesn't shut it off anymore. But here's the old one sitting right there. So it gets to 111 PSI, which is the number printed on it, and then it opens up. So I'm pretty impressed with that, given that this is probably the only time that thing's ever actually opened. But I'm gonna let it do that a few times, and then I'll go ahead and reinstall it on the other air compressor.
All right, so I got it back together. I took the motor apart and re-greased the bushings in it. I was kind of disappointed that it doesn't have ball bearings. It's bushings on either end, and the one on that end wasn't too happy. Either it just wasn't happy to begin with, or it didn't like me taking it apart, one of the two. But that's got new grease, and hopefully we'll be fine. Capacitor's in there. Although it really doesn't look it, I did go through and clean the whole thing with some soap and water and brushed it all down. So you can actually tell what color it used to be. And it still looks dirty just because the layer of just filth that has been on this thing is just not one to come off. So I still need to put oil in the compressor. I haven't done that yet. I fixed this So it's the original plastic piece. I tried to take one off of the little Husky compressor over there because it doesn't shut off anyways, so it doesn't use the unloader valve because that's all broken on it. But of course, you know, that one was also broken. The unloader valve didn't work. So what I did is this piece of plastic has a little orifice in it just to let the air out slowly in a, you know, controlled manner. And so I drilled it just a slightly smaller diameter than the hole or than the tubing without going through that orifice and messing up whatever diameter it is. And put JB Weld on everything, push the tube in there, put JB Weld around the whole outside, and then put the nut on that. So the tube is adhered to the plastic, the nut is adhered to the tube, and the nut is adhered to the plastic as well. So hopefully that will hold that all together. And seems to be all right. And just kind of lightly brushed everything up just to kind of so you can tell what it used to look like. This is a new cord that we put on it the last time we messed with it. I left this one because overall it seems to be okay. Has a ground on it that we put on, so that's all good. I went ahead and just preemptively backed down the cutout pressure 3/4 of a turn, just because this thing's supposed to run up to 100 psi, and there's no point. It doesn't need to do that. I mean, it doesn't need to work that hard. So we'll see what that adjustment ends up being. And I got my air filter on it, which looks like it's adhered to the compressor, but it's not. So kind of the same deal as the other one, except I didn't drill any holes and bolt anything up. It's a 3D printed piece. And what this filter is this is the insert to a small oil filter. I already threw it away, but it was off of just a little generator, and I used a big pipe cutter to cut the top of the, or to kind of start separating the oil filter at the top. And then I drilled out all the spot welds, and it just fell apart at that point. And so to get all the oil out of it, I soaked it in lacquer thinner. And then I found a socket, a deep well socket that fit in here, because it also has that little piece on the inside that would ride on the socket. So I put the socket in there, put it on an extension, and I actually stuck it in the Miller box over there and just had the compressor nozzle down there on the little compressor, just spinning this thing as fast with everything it had. And that pretty much threw the majority of the oil off of it. So it's not just dripping oil anymore. So that's good. Put a little daub of JB Weld on that just because that was where the bypass was, and I just don't want that leaking anything. So that just presses in there like that. So that'll be good. Nathan donated a gauge to the project, so I got a pretty decent looking gauge on there. It matches. I mean, nothing on this thing matches, but it looks, pretty period correct for what was on there. So I'm gonna put some oil in the compressor and then see what it does. All right, so it's all together, and this isn't the hose that's gonna be staying on it if I didn't already mention that. I'm gonna put a shorter hose on it. That's just the most convenient one to mess with right now. So I got it all back together. I had to clean the belt and the pulleys off because it kept slipping, and I don't want to put a whole bunch of tension on that bushing on the electric motor. So I got the gauge on there. So as you can see, I have been running it just to see how well it would work. And so far it seems to be working pretty good. Really haven't had any issues with it. Everything seems to work. I thought the regulator was broke from the last time we messed with it. And I think it was just that we had it threaded in too far. This regulator might be a little bit oversized for this compressor. Almost said capacitor. But I threaded it all the way out with no air pressure in it, threaded it all the way out to where it just fell out. And I threaded it back in about 5 turns to see where that was. And that had it regulating pressure down to like 1 psi. So that showed me that the gauge worked, which it's a super cool gauge. But I wanted it to work because it goes to 30 psi, and I don't want to be running the tank higher than 30 psi and then, tearing this gauge up, just maxing it out. So regulator is currently working the gauge and showing 20 psi. And then just like on the other Craftsman air compressor I messed with, I dropped the cutout pressure down. Just because, same reason as the other one, there's no point in making this thing run harder than it needs to for anything I would ever use it for. And because that gauge only goes to 30 psi and I don't want to be maxing that gauge out and tearing it up, there really isn't any point in this thing pumping up much over 30 psi. So I think the way I got it set up right now is I backed the main screw out 4 turns, and the cutout screw, I think I did a 3/4 of a turn on that one, although I'm really not sure how much that one did. And it cuts out at, I think, 45 psi is what it did earlier. And the unloader valve is all working the way it's supposed to. It leaks a little bit, but I mean, that's not a big deal at all, really. So far, the JB Weld's holding. Everything seems to be working good. Air filter's working, motor's not getting hot, the compressor seems happy. It's supposed to have a non-detergent 20-weight oil in it, is what it says on the nameplate. And I was going to put some good compressor oil in it, but that stuff is like $22 a quart at Tractor Supply. And not knowing if this thing was going to leak oil, and really for how much it's going to get used, I couldn't justify spending $22 for oil. So for now, it just has some regular motor oil in it, just a 10W30. And I'm just going to order some non-detergent 20-weight for it, and I'll put that in there whenever it shows up. But yeah, so gauges seem to be accurate. I mean, it builds air pressure. So I'm going to plug it in here, and, well, you'll see it when it's running, because I can't do that with 2 hands. There's no on-off switch on this thing, which I guess also supports the idea that this thing is considerably older than the 70s. That's your on-off switch. You have to plug it in and unplug it. So that is that. Let's get it going.
It makes a pretty distinct sound when it runs. I don't know if you can see that, but the dipstick acts as a breather, and it has a check valve that just sits there and pops open and closed.
All right, so I said 45. looked at the gauge wrong. It cuts out at pretty much exactly 60. At least according to that gauge. So that's pretty cool. You can see the regulator was working good. Motor is hardly even warm. Compressor head's not that warm. That tube is incredibly hot. That one's just kind of lukewarm. Yeah, that guy though is real hot. So yeah, and I didn't get real crazy with the cleaning, just because, I mean, it's all the paint's pretty well torn up anyways. It's not like, I mean, I'd be cleaning it up just to show bare metal. But it looks good. And so the unloader valve works, so it already dumped all the pressure out of it. Yep. So let some pressure off and see how it starts back up. See what pressure it comes back on at. So there it goes. So I believe it's rated for 2.9 CFM at 40 PSI, which, I mean, it's not a lot, but granted, this thing's probably from the 60s, and this was about the nicest compressor of that vintage that I could find. Most of the ones I looked at didn't even have a tank on them. It was just this bit, and you just took your air hose right up off the pump. Yeah, holding this open, I mean, it can just barely keep up at 40 PSI. So that's pretty impressive. Drop our regulator pressure down. I don't know if I ever showed this regulator, but it's super cool looking. Whoa, that was the wrong way. Try and get it at 15. Yeah, see, it's super sensitive on this thing. Yeah, there we go. So it's weird that it has a gauge that's only rated for 30 PSI, because the compressor itself was originally set to run at 100 PSI, and the pop-off valve opens up at 110 PSI, I think. So I don't know if this gauge is original or not. It may not be. But regardless, it looks cool, so it's staying on there. But yeah, the other Craftsman air compressor, I had to lower the volume on all the clips of it running because it was so loud. But this one actually runs really, really quiet. I mean, it's not silent by any means, but it's pretty bearable as far as an air compressor goes. All right, and so with that, I believe we are going to call that good. Looks like it's leaking a little bit of oil out of that breather deal. Might have it overfilled. In case anybody cares, which, oh, it's 2.5 psi, or 2.5 CFM at 40. But there's the info for the compressor and the info for the motor. Oh, and I added a ground to it if that wasn't already mentioned. Yep, there it is. Back in action. Probably won't use it much, but hey, at least it works. Piece of history is a lot cooler when it works, so I'm glad to get it going again, and hopefully it'll stick around and stay happy for a good while. So yep, thanks for watching. See what ends up coming up next.